Welcome to the garage. I'm Robert, and this is Haslip CycleWorks. Today we're going to go over how I solved a dilemma that I ran into in my garage while working on the Vulcan. If you watched the previous video about the Vulcan build, you'll know that I lowered the front end. The front end's been lowered roughly 3.5 inches. Now that the front end's lowered, we need to lower the rear end of the bike. Otherwise, we're going to throw our handling out the window. Could become dangerous. Not looking for that. So we need to get the rear end lowered to match the front. The dilemma that I ran into is, how do I keep the bike upright and adjust the rear end of the bike with no shocks on it, because that's what we're measuring for, to get it lowered to where we need. How do we adjust that rear end down to where it needs to be, where we measure off the bottom of the frame to the floor at 2 pickup locations to make sure that we're sitting at the right angle? Well, kickstand, not an option. The bike's lowered so much that on the factory kickstand, it doesn't lean very far, so it's not very secure. Plus, on the kickstand, the bike is actually leaned over. If you've ever seen a bike on its kickstand, you'll see that it's kind of leaned over and the handlebars are turned to kind of keep it from rocking. We don't want that. We need the bike to sit straight up and down in order to get proper measurements. Center stand, not on this particular bike. Some bikes do have it, but again, you're stuck. You can't raise or lower the center stand to kind of manipulate the bike to get it where we need to be. So, and of course, we don't have yet a scissor lift table for a bike with a wheel chock in the front. Would love to have one, just haven't gotten one yet. Need to rearrange some things in the garage to make room for that. Moving on. However, that did get me thinking, if I had a wheel chock, I could set the bike up and put some sort of jack near the rear end, just ahead of the swing arm, because we don't want to interfere with that. We just want to be able to adjust it. So wheel chock in the front and some sort of jack in the rear. That could work. So this is what I came up with. For the rear of the bike, let me show you. This is what I picked up for the rear of the bike to provide our adjustment. Just a mini scissors lift for the rear. Frame of the bike sits here, and we can raise and lower it any way we need. As high as, I mean, we're not lifting the bike, we're actually lowering it, so it doesn't need to go very high. So these are adjustable. Frame rails sit here. These even are height adjustable as well. Weight capacity on this jack is 1,100 pounds. Thank God the Vulcan is nowhere near that weight, so we don't have to worry about that. Amazon. I want to say $50. Like I usually do, I'll put a link down in the description where you can see this exact jack. Now the real dilemma is the front. Now that we have a way to lift the rear and keep it steady, how do we keep the front locked down? Picked up this little gem. I want to say it was $35. It's a legit wheel chock. And for those of you who are really sharp, you'll notice that this particular model is actually made to be bolted down to the floor or on a motorcycle lift or to the bed of a truck. That's not what we're doing here. The reason I went with this version is it was $35 versus the $65 for this freestanding version. I could not justify spending the extra $30 to make a freestanding one. By purchasing this and then using some scrap angle, I think we can make our own freestanding wheel chock that will secure the front end, keep it from tipping and falling over, and then the rear, the jack will give us the adjustment we need to find the right length of shocks. So follow along as we turn this into a $65 tool instead of a $35 tool. So the big difference between this wheel chock and the more expensive version that's offered at Harbor Freight simply is two arms that come off to the side. For less than the difference in the cost between this version and the more expensive version, we can add our own arms at the length that we want and make almost the same product, if not better, for less price. So that's a win-win. I'm going to switch cameras and get in a little closer on this edge here. I'm not sure if you can see it from this camera, but it's actually at an angle. So if we were to take our piece of steel and cut it straight, there's going to be a gap. So let me switch cameras here and show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so we're going to take something that we know is square and true. In this case is my 1, 2, 3 block. We're going to lay it up against the edge of this, and you can see the angle here. So if we were to cut our scrap piece of angle straight at 90 degrees, we'd have a huge gap at the top. That's never going to work. You don't want, this isn't the type of thing that you want to half-ass here. The fitment is key. It's usually the key for most weld joints as well, but you want it to be nice and tight up against the mating surface and no real gaps. Makes for a stronger joint, a better looking joint, and the effort that you put into this is going to show in the final product. Like my boy Deadpool says, maximum effort, and it's going to show. And you'll have a safer, sturdier part because of the effort that you put into it. So what we're going to have to do is actually figure out what this angle is, and then when we go to cut our leg that we're going to weld here, we want that to match. So we're going to have to figure out what this angle is, and to do that we can find this angle with this angle finder that I picked up earlier from Harbor Freight. So we'll go ahead and figure out what we're working with here, and it looks like 45 degrees. Not sure if you can see that or if it picks it up on camera, but it's 45 degrees. So what we're going to want to do is cut our steel at that same 45-degree angle, which if this were a piece of flat stock or even square tube would not be a problem. But because this is a piece of angle, you can see that dilemma. So if we were to just put this in the saw and cut on one face at 45, that's not going to give us what we want, because we don't want this to sit like this. We want it to sit like that to give us the most purchase on the ground to keep it from rocking. So I'll show you next how we put this in our saw, and we're going to be using abrasive cutoff saw, and I'll show you how we mount this up and cut it safely and correctly at the same angle. Okay, so we're now at our chop saw, and never mind the second camera over here. I want to give you guys a real good angle when we actually start cutting this. We still have our angle gauge locked in at the 45 degrees, and just to verify, I never trust these built-in angle indicators. They're usually off, and they usually have a large amount of slop in them. So what I like to do is, we know we need 45 degrees. We're going to actually but our angle finder that's locked in at the 45 degrees up against the rest and the saw blade. And we are actually at 45 degrees, and our built-in angle finder is actually just a little off. So I'm glad we checked that. So now that we've got our blade and our rest set to the right angle, we can go ahead and load our piece of angle iron in and get it locked in. So because we want to cut here and here at the same time, at the same angle, we don't want to rest the piece in at a 90. We actually want to roll it in so that we get the cut at the same angle on both sides at the same time. Which can be rather difficult. You want both ends, both sides, up against this rest tightly. And then we'll lock our stock in, and we don't want to cut too much of this angle too far into our piece because this is all we have to work with. I'll go ahead and line this up so that we just barely miss the corner here when we come down. I'm gonna make sure this is firm against that rest, and we're gonna crank her down. Not too tight, but tight enough to hold it in, because if we crank it down too much, it'll actually twist the bed of this thing and rotate our piece against this rest. So we want it to stay accurate. I don't believe that's gonna go anywhere. And we're lined up, so we'll get our cut. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're cutting with one of these abrasive cutoff wheels or abrasive cutoff saws is this blade actually has some give in it. It's not as rigid as, say, a carbide steel blade or something along those lines. So when you go to cut this, you don't need to jam down on this thing. Let the blade do the work. Of course, apply some pressure, but you don't need to put your entire weight down on this thing, because it will drift and you'll end up with a half-assed cut. So get it going and just constant even pressure, not a lot, and just let the blade do the work. I'm going to put my safety glasses on and my hearing protection, and we're going to go ahead and zip through this. Now that we're done cutting through that side, we're going to go ahead and flip it around and pay attention to how it's going to cut, and go ahead and cut through the other side. Okay, so we've got our parts cut, cleaned up. We've got our parts cut. The next step to get this ready to weld on, we've got to remove this black coating that came on it from factory. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is take these bolts and nuts out and just get down to this plate, and we'll go ahead and strip the paint or powder coat or whatever this is off where these pieces will mount. So I'll go ahead and take that apart and get this all cleaned up. Okay, now that we've got that all apart, I'm going to go ahead and take the coating off. Okay, as you can see, I've cleaned my parts off. I have wiped everything down with acetone. I'm going to go ahead and use some of my fixture clamps that I've made in a previous video. Clamp it down. I don't want to clamp the mess out of it because we don't want this thing to banana. So we just want to hold everything in place where we've got it and keep it from bending and turning into a rocking horse instead of a stable platform when we start to put heat in it when we weld. So I'm going to go ahead and clamp this up, and I'll bring you back once it's clamped up and we get ready to start welding. Okay, so as you can see, I've got my clamps down. Everything's locked down nice and solid, ready to be welded. I'm going to go ahead and suit up and fire up my Everlast TIG, and I'm just going to tack things together, and we'll double check everything, make sure everything is where it's supposed to be and nothing's moved, and then we'll burn it in completely. Okay, now that we've got our fusion tacks in, I'm satisfied with how everything looks. We're going to go ahead and run these beads with some filler. Just a little tech tip for you guys. I'm actually using stainless wire on mild steel. Sometimes if you're unsure of how clean the base metal is going to be with mild steel, you can actually run some stainless wire, and that'll keep your porosity down and give you a cleaner weld without a whole bunch of popping and stuff if you uncover some garbage under the surface of the base metal. But that is pretty much it. Like I said, I'm going to let it cool down for a few minutes. If the modification that you've done works or not, it's to put it to use, see if you have an issue. So I went ahead and rolled the bike up into the stand that we modded, and here we go. As you can see, the front wheel is locked into place in our wheel chock that we modded. The rear of the bike is supported by our mini lift jack, although we still have weight on the rear. And kickstand is down, but it's not on the ground. I would call that a success. So until next time, guys, get up, get out, and do it.